Good evening, everyone. My name is Martha Roth. I'm the Dean of the Division of the Humanities at the University of Chicago, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you all this evening to the first lecture in the first series of lectures of the Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lectures. These lectures are named for our dear friends, Randy and Melvin Berlin. In establishing this lecture series, they wish to bring leading public intellectuals with impact on society to our campus, to highlight the importance of the humanities in public discourse, and to see that impact achieve lasting resonance through an enduring publication. Thus, each series of lectures will be presented on a core subject with the speaker focused on developing one theme that will result in a book to be published by the University of Chicago Press. Randy and Melvin Berlin are exemplary philanthropists. The word philanthropy, of course, means love of humanity, and Randy and Melvin truly do love humanity and the humanities. With their gifts to the University of Chicago, including especially an endowment in 2008 of a professorship in the development of the novel, and now the endowment of a signature lecture series, Randy and Melvin live their values and aspirations and set examples for others. The Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lectures will be an annual high point in the calendar of the University of Chicago well into the future. Each year, a notable intellectual will grace our campus to explore some of her or his most interesting ideas, making the University of Chicago a vital destination for public intellectuals. To commemorate these lectures, a plaque will be mounted here in the Reynolds Club right outside Mandel Hall, and each year the name of a scholar of distinction will be added to the plaque as that year's Berlin Family Lecturer, beginning this year with Lawrence Lessig. Our next academic year, the Berlin Family Lecturer will be Amitav Ghosh, Indian-born writer of such acclaimed novels as The Calcutta Chromosome, The Glass Palace, and the Ibis Trilogy, and winner, of course, of numerous prizes and awards, including the Arthur C. Clarke Award and the Dan David Prize. The following year, the Berlin Family Lecturer will be Mario Vargas Llosa, Peruvian writer and journalist, and winner of the 2010 Nobel Prize in Literature. For each of these individuals, serving as the Berlin Family Lecturer will certainly be among their most enduring distinctions. As you leave, please take a moment to admire the plaque outside the door. At this time, I'd like to ask Randy and Melvin to please stand at their seats and ask all of you to join me in thanking them for their generosity to the University of Chicago, and above all, for their vision and for their philanthropy. The Berlin Family Lectures are curated by the Roman Family Director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society in consultation with faculty colleagues and the Dean of the Division of the Humanities. It is now going to be my pleasure to introduce my colleague, David Nierenberg, the Dean of the Division of Social Sciences, the Deborah R. and Edgar D. Giannata Professor in Social Thought, in History, in Romance Languages and Literatures, and the College, and as the first director of the Neubauer Collegium, the curator of this Berlin Family Lecture series. David Nierenberg was educated at Yale for his undergraduate work and received his graduate training in history at Princeton. He began his academic career at Rice University, moving from there to Johns Hopkins University and joining our faculty in 2006. He is the author of Communities of Violence, Persecution of Minorities in the Middle Ages, 1996, in which he examined the role of violence in the coexistence of the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish populations and communities of France and Spain. In Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, in 2013, David traced the function of the figure of the Jew in the political and religious discourse from antiquity through to the 20th century. His most recent work, published just this month by the University of Chicago Press, is Neighboring Faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in the Middle Ages and Today, focusing on medieval and early modern Spain, the land of three religions, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims interacted, and as David puts it in the introduction, not only as abstractions or categories in each other's theologies and ideologies, but also as neighbors forced to jostle together on narrow streets, figures of thought elbowing figures of flesh. He is also the author, among other works, of The Body of Christ in the Art of Europe and New Spain, and of Judaism and Christian Art, and the author of more than 80 articles and essays. David Nierenberg is the recipient of numerous honors and awards for his scholarship in teaching. He was recognized for teaching awards both at Rice and Johns Hopkins, and has secured prestigious appointments at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, the Center for Advanced Studies at Stanford, the Center for Advanced Studies in Munich, and the Wissenschaftskolleg Berlin. Ladies and gentlemen, here to introduce our featured speaker for the first lecture in the first series of lectures in the Randy L. and Melvin R. Berlin Family Lectures, please welcome David Nierenberg.
Wow. After an introduction like that, you'd almost think I was giving the lecture. Good evening, good afternoon, welcome. Thank you, Martha. To everything you said, I would only add that one of my greatest pleasures since arriving at Chicago has been my friendship with Randy and Melvin. And one of my greatest honors has been being the midwife to this lecture series and caring for it in its infancy. I think Randy and I were disagreeing about how long its infancy has been, but 1 or 2 years, 3 years. That responsibility has been a little daunting because the scope of Randy and Melvin's interests, and hence of this series, is so vast, and also, and I use this word without irony, so exalted. They care about what is fundamental, about what endures, whether in music, literature, law, art, science, or any number of other fields of human endeavor. They are interested in the beautiful and also in the profound, in the most abiding questions we ask ourselves and in the most lasting answers we find. Such high aspirations are a daunting challenge for me and now for my successor, Jonathan Lear. I think you'll agree, in fact, to any curator of a series such as this. But I hope you'll also agree that our first Berlin family lectures all rise to that challenge. You heard Martha's list, Maria Vargas Llosa, Amitav Ghosh, and today, as our inaugural Berlin family lecturer, Lawrence Lessig, the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School and the director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. In order to establish the greatness of today's speaker, I need perhaps say no more than that he was a professor at the University of Chicago, teaching at our law school from 1991 to 1997. But I'll say a little more, not only for form's sake, but also to give you a sense of the extraordinary diversity of Professor Lessig's interest and his activities. That diversity is evident already from his education, a BA in economics and a BS in management, and a master's in philosophy from Cambridge, as well as a JD from Yale University. He clerked for our own Richard Posner here in Chicago and for Antonin Scalia at the Supreme Court. There's probably no better known expert on intellectual property in the contemporary world than Lawrence Lessig, and no more influential champion for the free exchange of ideas in the digital era. He was, as you all know, a founder of the Creative Commons and of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, among many other groups, and the author of books like Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, The Future of Ideas, and Free Culture. In recent years, he has turned his attention to an even more general problem, that of corruption in political cultures, establishing grassroots organizations, such as Root Strikers, and authoring books such as his Republic Lost of 2011, activities climaxing in the ideas he's about to present to us over the next 5 weeks in this lecture series entitled, that was wishful thinking, in this lecture series entitled America Compromised. It may, at first blush, seem odd for me to present Lawrence Lessig, whose activities are so vitally contemporary, as an example of the Berlin Family Lecture's emphasis on fundamental and enduring questions and values. The internet era, or the internet, did not, after all, exist in any age before our own. And in fact, even Larry Lessig, like all of us in his generation, grew up without it. But the questions that Lessig asks and the ideals whose future he is exploring are among the oldest and most important for all of us interested in inquiry about the good, the true, and the beautiful. His attempt to map spaces of freedom for scholarly ideas from the exigencies of contract and market resonates with some 2 millennia of effort, reaching to the very foundations of philosophy. As a medievalist, I think of phrases like scientia sine praecio est, knowledge is without price, or scientia donum Dei est unde vendi non potest, science is a gift of God and therefore you cannot sell it, as the medieval bishops assembled at the Third Lateran Council in 1179 put it. And long before the birth of the God that those bishops were worshiping, thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, and their students were deeply absorbed in questions about what is individual and what is collective in human knowledge, what is perishable and what is eternal, a debate that Aristotle's followers developed over the centuries into the idea of an immortal collective intellect, a type of, pardon my borrowing, a type of creative commons made up of all scholarly souls that have ever or will ever live. These resonances perhaps explain why so many intellectuals are drawn to Lessig's ideas about intellectual property. The questions he is asking about corruption in Republic Lost and other works are no less fundamental, no less ageless. Anyone educated at the University of Chicago will recognize them from another book with the word Republic in its English title, Plato's Politeia, The Republic. That book begins by rejecting a number of bad definitions of justice, such as justice is to benefit your friends and harm your enemies. And it proceeds to show us how so many of the ideals we most value, ideals such as friendship, family, loyalty, prosperity, can, if not subject to constant criticism and reflection, themselves also become sources of corruption and of injustice and inequality. Larry Lessig is, I suspect, about to provide us with a similar vision of our own republic. We may not always agree with the answers he is proposing any more than we need agree with Plato's, but we cannot deny the importance of the problems he is posing. So without any further ado, let me invite Larry Lessig to present to you as the inaugural Berlin Family Lecture the first of his studies in institutional corruption, the Paradigm Case, Congress.
Dean Roth, Dean Nirenberg, Randy and Melvin Berlin, thank you so much for the honor and the opportunity to present these lectures here. It is an ambitious idea that one could present just 5 lectures over the course of 5 weeks and hold an audience for that time. It's a question I've struggled with a lot in the 6 months I've been working on these lectures. And as I was walking over this morning, I was reminded of a course I had at Cambridge taught by Elizabeth Anscombe, who was, of course, one of the great philosophers, a Wittgenstein student. And she had announced in the year that I graduated from Cambridge that she would deliver the final lectures of her career. And so the first lecture was filled with about this many people as everybody scrambled to get the final words from Elizabeth Anscombe. And it was completely incomprehensible. And so the second lecture, there were about half as many people in the room, and it was still incomprehensible. And the third, there were fewer, and the fourth, there were fewer. And after about 5 lectures, there were 2 of us, me and a friend. And I said to him, you can't drop because it would be a disaster if you drop. And he said, I won't drop. But of course, after a couple more lectures, he dropped. So Anscombe came in one day, and she started her lecture, and then halfway through, she looked up and she said, it's just us. And thinking quickly, I said, Professor, it's always been just us. And she said, fine point, and she continued her lecture. Now, I offer that as a joke you might offer me when, at the end of these lectures, I look out in the audience and find the equivalent number sitting here welcoming my words. So I hope at least that will leaven the experience a bit. So these lectures will be a book. But a great book is not a great lecture, or even a mediocre book is not a good lecture. So the structure and the presentation of the material I'm going to give you in these lectures will differ from the way I present them in the book. That should be encouraging to you because it might be a bit more compelling. It will be a relief to the press because there won't be all these colored pictures they need to include in the book. So the point is you should separate in your mind the presentation I want to give here and understand it as a form of rhetoric designed to convince you that there is a subject to study called institutional corruption that is distinct from what we ordinarily think of as corruption. Okay, now if you remember the days before Ebola, just a couple weeks ago actually, you might recall that there was an event in Hong Kong where hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong residents turned out to protest the latest proposals from China governing the mode by which the chief executive in Hong Kong would be selected. China had promised in 2007 that by 2016, the chief executive, the governor of Hong Kong, would be elected. But at the end of August, they specified the procedure by which the chief executive would be selected. And as they directed, the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. Now, that nominating committee was to be about 1,200 citizens. So out of 5 million, that means about 0.024% of Hong Kong got to sit on the nominating committee. So Hong Kong's democracy was going to be like this. There would be an election where all citizens got to vote. But then there would be a nominations process where the 1,200 got to vote. And you had to do well in the nominating process to be able to run in the election. That was the structure of their democracy. And this structure triggered an extraordinary strike. Because as activists insisted, the 1,200 would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. And as Martin Lee, Hong Kong's chairman of the Democratic Party, put it, quote, "We want genuine universal suffrage, not democracy with Chinese characteristics." Okay, now, what is the problem that Lee is pointing to here? When he says, we want genuine universal suffrage, he's invoking an ideal which is familiar to people who think about the nature of democratic theory. It's a democratic ideal. We could call it the equal weight principle. The equal weight principle, we could formalize it like this. Each citizen should have equal weight in each stage of a democratic procedure, each stage of a democracy. Or maybe more simply, we could say, no inequality should be allowed for an improper reason. So if people have the opportunity to vote, but they just choose not to vote, they're too lazy to vote, there's an effective inequality, but we wouldn't think that's an illegitimate reason. It's a self-imposed inequality. So the point of this principle is to say a democracy requires equal opportunity to participate in the various stages of the democracy. So Hong Kong was to be a two-staged democracy, and the claim of the activists was that there was a biased filter in the first stage. Biased. Because this 1,200-person committee would reflect, they said, a pro-Beijing perspective and a pro-business and political elite perspective. So either it was the wrong loyalty to a different country, or it would be non-representative. And the claim was either way, it would violate what we can call this equal weight principle. Okay, but it's the second part of what Lee described that I want to focus on for a bit. He said they didn't want a democracy with Chinese characteristics. Chinese characteristics. And is that, in fact, what Lee is describing? Because in my view, it is not particularly Chinese, unless Boss Tweed was an ancient Chinese prophet. Because as Tweed famously said, I don't care who does the electing as long as I get to do the nominating. And we can call this instinct for how to organize a democracy Tweedism. Tweedism. And what Tweedism constitutes is a two-stage, or more generally, an end-stage election process where the first stage is controlled by what we could call the Tweeds. And in any such structure, the question we should ask is the filter that the Tweeds impose biased? And if it is biased, it violates the principle, the equal weight principle I articulated, and if it's not, it doesn't. And it's important to recognize that that filter need not be biased. Jim Fishkin, who's a professor at Stanford, developed the idea of deliberative polls. I'm supposed to put a registered mark next to that, but I can't bring myself to do it, so I'm just going to use deliberative poll without the registered mark. A deliberative poll is a small sample, randomly representative sample of people in a population who are brought together to deliberate about matters. And you could conceive of the nominating committee in Hong Kong as constituted by a similar deliberative poll, pulling together in a representative and random way 1,200 people to vote on who should be the candidate that the rest of Hong Kong gets to vote, or the candidates they get to vote among. And if it truly was representative and randomly selected, then it wouldn't be a biased filter, even if it was a filter that not everyone in Hong Kong could participate in. So the point is, it's possible for this two-stage process not to violate the equal weight principle, but I suggest it's rare. I suggest that if we think about Tweedism as a phenomenon in the way democracies get organized, and understand it as a two-stage or an end-stage process with a biased filter at some critical stage, using this device, we can understand a great deal of actual democratic practice. Let's start, for example, with democracy in America, or let's say Tweedism in America. First, in the Old South. Of course, it's an astonishing, embarrassing, quite humbling fact that almost 100 years after the Constitution gave African Americans the right to vote effectively, they still didn't have a right to vote. You remember the history, I'm sure. There was this war, this Civil War. And in the middle of that war, in a classic bait and switch, Abraham Lincoln redefined the war. Until that point, everybody believed this was a war about the Union, about keeping the Union together, not a war about slavery. Indeed, so clear was this that Abraham Lincoln had originally suggested that perhaps the 13th Amendment should be an amendment that guaranteed perpetually slavery in the slave states. But at Gettysburg, all this changed. At Gettysburg, Lincoln declared the war to be about a nation dedicated to a proposition. Not the proposition that the Union was inviolable, but that all men are created equal. Now, that proposition, of course, appeared nowhere in the Constitution's text. It's drawn from the Declaration of Independence. But some 300,000 casualties into the war, this now became the defining character of what that war would be about. And then almost 7 years later, the United States did what no one thought was possible at the time of the Gettysburg Address. They ratified an amendment to the Constitution that expressly said the vote shall not be denied on the basis of one's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, at least some imagined when they ratified that amendment, the future would look something like this. But in fact, the future looked very different from that. Because for 100 years, okay, I'm exaggerating, for 95 years, there was a concerted effort to exclude African Americans from the right to vote. Through literacy tests, registration systems, poll tax, the grandfather clause, and then Texas's most ambitious innovation, the all-white primary. By law, first directly and then indirectly, explicitly forbidding African Americans from voting in the Democratic primary. So how can we understand the Old South? We can understand the Old South to have presented a two-step democracy. There was a general election, which presumptively didn't exclude any citizen from the right to vote. But then there was a white primary. And you had to do well in the white primary to be able to run in the general election. A two-stage democracy which excluded a significant portion of the South from that critical first stage. Of course, they were not totally excluded from the democratic process. We could remix a bit the Supreme Court's words in Citizens United and say, the people, including blacks, have the ultimate influence over elected officials, because after all, there is this general election, but they have that influence only after whites have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. So they were excluded where it mattered, as Tweed would have said, in the nominating. And of course, the consequence, obviously, of that exclusion was a democracy responsive to whites only. That's Tweedism. A white primary that biased the filter by excluding people on the basis of race, an exclusion we would now deem obviously illegitimate. Or here's a second example, much more important to the argument of this lecture. Think about New America. We take it for granted in America that campaigns will be privately funded. And we recognize, of course, that the funding of campaigns is an essential step to the opportunity to be a candidate who has any chance of winning in any of the major races that determine our government. So we could think about funding as a kind of nominating process, the process by which one gets nominated to be able to run, by appealing to funders of campaigns to nominate the candidate, to make it so that candidate could run. So structurally, we have a nomination and an election, a two-stage process, where in the first stage, the funders of campaigns get to vote, and in the second stage, all citizens get to cast a formal vote to select who will be elected. Now think a bit about the relationship between these funders and members of Congress. As this system has evolved, members of Congress now spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And as they do this, as they dial for dollars for 3 or 4 or more hours per day, they learn something. They learn what they must do to induce the party on the other end of the line to give them the money they need to run their campaigns. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needed to survive. This is a picture of the modern American congressperson as she learns through this osmosis which buttons he or she must push in order to get the sustenance his or her campaign needs to survive. As any of us would, as they do this, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do will affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So as we think about this dance between members and candidates and their funders, we should think a little bit about who are the funders. Who are the relevant funders? Who are the funders who give enough to matter? Who give enough so that on that sheet, which they go through as they dial for dollars, they know exactly which issues that particular funder might be caring about. Who are those funders? And as I've calculated it for my book, Republic Lost, I concluded that it's no more than about 0.05% of America who are the relevant funders of campaigns. About 150,000 Americans, which, as the internet tells me, is the same number of people as are named Lester in the United States, which is why I named my TED Talk Lesterland. And after the Supreme Court's decision this year in McCutcheon, which removed aggregate limits on campaign contributions for all candidates together, I think the number of relevant funders is going to fall even more to maybe about 35,000, which turns out to be the same number of people as are named Sheldon in the United States. Or think about the innovation by the D.C. Circuit that created the Super PAC. In 2012, 132 Americans contributed 60% of the money that was spent by super PACs in that election cycle, which is about the same number of people as are named Adolf in the United States. So the point is, whether it's Lesterland or Sheldon City or Adolphia, this is a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1% of America that dominates this first stage of our elections. So we have a general election where all citizens get to vote. But now we have not a white primary, but a green primary, where the relevant funders of campaigns get to vote. And you must do well in the green primary to have a chance to run effectively in the general election. Not always. There are candidates like Jerry Brown, but in the main, you believe you must do well, and in 94% of the cases, the candidate with the most money wins. This is the picture of democracy in America. The majority is now excluded from a critical first step along the way to electing representatives. They're not totally excluded. Supreme Court was completely right in Citizens United because the people have the ultimate influence over the elected officials. There is a general election. But the people have that influence only after the funders have had their way with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And the consequence, unsurprisingly, is a democracy increasingly responsive to these funders, and if Princeton is right, maybe only responsive to the funders. I'm going to cite a Princeton study, which I'm not supposed to be doing, so I'll put that off the stage very quickly. Martin Gillens and Ben Page just published last month the largest empirical study of policy decisions by our government in the history of political science. Tried to relate those policy decisions to the attitudes of the economic elite, organized business interest, and the average voter. And what they found was that while decisions, actual decisions by our government, track the economic elites' support. So as more of the economic elites support something, more people, it's more likely that will be passed. And they track organized business interests. The more organized business interest supports something, the more likely it will be to pass. As they concluded about the average voter, they said, quote, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. What that means is, as the average voter supports something, from 0% to 10% to 40% to 60% to 80% to 100%, that doesn't change the probability that that measure will be passed, independent of the support that measure might have from the economic elites or organized business interests. This is a democracy, quote unquote, unresponsive to the attitudes of average American voters. And this is Tweedism too. It is a two-stage election process with a bias in the first filter. A bias on the basis of wealth, a bias which I think we should judge as illegitimate. Why should we judge it as illegitimate? Well, I'm an old originalist. Most of my constitutional work has been understanding the Constitution as the framers would have understood it, translated in light of changed circumstances. So let's think a bit about how the framers understood our form of government. The framers intended to give us a government that would be responsive to, quote, the people. And by the people, of course, they weren't much thinking about women versus men. They were thinking about men. And by the people, of course, they were not thinking of African Americans versus whites. They were thinking about whites. But by the people, they were thinking explicitly about the relationship between the people and wealth. And as Madison put it in Federalist 57, by the people he meant, quote, not the rich more than the poor. Not the rich more than the poor. The form of government they were creating, they believed would guarantee that the citizens they considered relevant citizens would have equal role in the democracy, at least in the selection and the control of the popular branch of government, at that point, the House of Representatives. Now, as you think about these different examples of Tweedism, of course, there are important differences. There are differences in the biased filter. So, for example, Boss Tweed's filter was completely intentionally biased. He meant it to be so. In Hong Kong, the claim is that China intends the filter to be biased to benefit Chinese policy. In the Old South, obviously, they structured the elections intentionally to exclude African Americans so that whites could control the process of government. But I suggested in New America, it's not fair to say that this system has been crafted intentionally. No one planned it like this. It has evolved like this. So if we accept that characterization, which I know some would challenge, but let's take the hardest of the assumptions. Let's assume it's an unintended bias. How could an unintended bias constitute, quote unquote, corruption? Okay, well, this requires us to think a bit about what we mean by this term corruption. There's a modern way of thinking about the term corruption, captured most forcefully by Laura Unterkaufler in her book, Captured by Evil. She describes corruption in the following way, quote, corruption is a status. A person, when corrupt, has changed. Evil has captured her being, her essence, her soul. It is a searing indictment somehow not only of A's act, but of A's character. It is a statement not only of what A has done, but of what A has become. Now, when we think about Congress, this selection of pronouns is a little bit unfair. It's better to say him in this context because there's literally been only one female member of Congress in the history of Congress who's been convicted of corruption. Every other one has been men, so I'm not sure it's fair to tag women in this way, but whatever pronoun you'd like. The point is to recognize the character of the wrong she's identified and to see that she's talking about the way in which corruption marks a person's being. It is what an individual, as she puts it, has become. That's our modern sense. But there's an older sense of corruption, as described by Leslie Hill. Until the end of the 18th century, corruption had a much broader meaning than it does today. It referred less to the actions of individuals than to the general moral health of the body politic. So it's not just what an individual has become, it's also what an institution or a body politic has become, predicated not just of persons, but of entities or societies. And that's the sense of corruption that I mean to talk about here. When I'm describing the corruption of Congress, I'm not talking about cash secreted in brown paper bags in violation of federal law. I'm not talking about Rob Blagojevich's sense of corruption. Nothing I'm talking about is illegal. Indeed, everything I'm talking about is currently perfectly legal and constitutionally protected. I'm not describing any bad souls in the story I want to tell. Instead, I'm not talking about individual corruption, rather institutional corruption, the corruption of the institution of Congress. So how is that corruption manifest? Well, if we think about the way corruption was used by the framers of our Constitution, you can notice very quickly a very different emphasis from the modern emphasis by at least our Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in Citizens United, for example, in describing corruption, said when Buckley, a case that originally set the First Amendment standard against the idea of corruption, when Buckley identified a sufficiently important governmental interest in preventing corruption or the appearance of corruption, that interest was limited to quid pro quo corruption. This is corruption as quid pro quo or corruption as a contract. What corruption is when I say, I will do this in exchange for you doing that. But the question that begs is that the only kind of corruption that our government may address? And for the originalists on the court, people who believe we should be interpreting the Constitution in the way the framers would have interpreted it, there at least ought to be an inquiry about what the framers would have understood the concept of corruption to mean. So 2 years ago, I conducted an empirical analysis of that question. We went to this extraordinary source that now exists, collecting all founding-related documents, newspapers, debates, ratifying convention proceedings. And we collected out of those documents every single place we could find the word corruption used. So there are 325 instances of the word corruption, or maybe it's more like this, corruption. And then I had those instances coded by independent research assistants, and we collected findings about the way the framers used the word corruption. And what we found, of course, is that they did use the word corruption to mean quid pro quo corruption. In 325 instances, we found 6 where they meant corruption to be quid pro quo. That means about 2% of the cases were quid pro quo corruption. And every one of those cases was corruption speaking of individuals, not of institutions. But in the balance of these cases, talk of individuals was relatively rare. Much more common was talk of institutions. close to 60% of the references were references talking about corruptions of institutions, and the most common of these was what was described as improper dependence. 9% of the cases were cases where they were talking about an institution developing an improper dependence. So, for example, when they spoke of the corruption of Parliament, they weren't talking about Parliament filled with people who were engaging in bribery. That's not what constituted the corruption of Parliament. Instead, it was the improper dependence that Parliament had on the king. Because of the rotten boroughs where the king could place men into Parliament, men who were dependent on the king, Parliament was not properly or sufficiently independent of the king because of these members in Parliament. And so the institution was corrupted by this improper dependence. That means this usage is 5 times more prevalent than the quid pro quo usage. Improper dependence is, I think, a sense of what they mean by corruption, if anything is. Now, that understanding of the framers has recently been confirmed by an extraordinary book by my friend Zephyr Teachout, Corruption in America, which is an account of the history of Americans' understanding, particularly the law's understanding of the idea of corruption. And she tells a much richer story of the relationship between corruption and the law than the Supreme Court's opinions suggest. But she, too, ties this conception of corruption to dependence. As she says, the language of dependence and corruption was so intertwined at the founding that in some cases, corruption and independence could sound like opposites. So in this sense, I want to suggest corruption as improper dependence. That's not to say that corruption is dependence. It's the corruption is improper dependence. Like Jane Austen, they were obsessed with this relationship between proper and improper dependence. Their articulation and understanding of the institutions they were designing was all about what was the right dependence for the particular institution. And when that right dependence was compromised, it was corrupt, quote unquote, because improperly dependent. This sense of corruption, I want to call dependence corruption. And now I want to place it in a scheme that will make it understandable relative to the modern conception of corruption. If we think about the difference between corruption predicated of an individual and corruption predicated of an institution, the paradigm case of individual corruption is quid pro quo corruption. Not the only, but the paradigm. But I want to suggest in the world of institutional corruption, there is an idea of dependence corruption. Not the only idea of institutional corruption. My colleague Dennis Thompson has written extensively about a conception of institutional corruption which is distinct from dependence corruption. But my point is, one kind of institutional corruption we should understand as dependence corruption, by which that simply means an institution finding an improper dependence relative to what dependence was met. Okay, let's pull it together for a second here to make sure we're on the same page. I've described for you an idea called tweedism, which is a 2-stage democracy which is biased at the first stage. And I said the United States is a tweedist democracy. If unintentionally so, still, I want to suggest, even if unintentionally so, it should be defined as corruption. And how could that be? Well, that required me to define corruption in a particular way that I suggest has echoes in our tradition, focused on institutions and focused on a particular conception of institutional corruption, namely dependence corruption. And that leads to the conclusion I want to suggest, which is that tweedism is an example of dependence corruption. So how is it such an example? Okay, well, dependence corruption, as I've described it, depends upon improper dependence. That's how we know that there is dependence corruption, because we say that dependence is improper. And improper dependence depends on us having a conception of what proper dependence would be. Only if we know what the proper dependence is can we say that the actual dependence is improper. So dependence corruption requires that we know what the dependence should be, and we know what the dependence is, and we see that they are different. So what is the proper dependence within our democracy? Well, the first response is to remark, of course, that the framers didn't give us what they thought was a democracy. They gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a, quote, representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 describes it, a government that would have a branch which ought to be dependent on the people alone, an exclusive dependence. So here's their model of government for at least the House of Representatives. There would be the people, there would be the government. I do my own slides. This won't be in the book, but you see this kind of cool way in which, sorry, I don't need to go that far back, cool way in which it bounces like that. That's for dramatic effect, in case you missed that. Okay, so that's the dependence they meant. The problem, of course, is that we have evolved a different dependence. Not just a dependence on the people, but increasingly a dependence on the funders, too. This is a dependence, too. It is different and conflicting from a dependence on the people alone, at least so long as the funders are not the people. And just in case anybody's not clear on this, let me just emphasize it again. The funders are not the people. The funders are the tiniest slice of the 1%. The funders are the negation of Madison's promise. They are the rich more than the poor. And they don't even represent the rich very well. They represent neither the rich nor the poor. They represent interests, special interests, which are not the interests that we could plausibly attribute to the people properly understood. This is a conflicting dependence. And in the way I've tried to articulate an understanding of corruption, this is the corruption. It is a corruption of an intended dependence within the system of our democracy, whether that corruption was intended or not. It is institutional corruption. It is the institutional corruption of this entity, the Congress. Now, what is the consequence? What does this corruption do? Francis Fukuyama's latest book, Political Order and Political Decay, has a very strong and harsh critique of the current form of American government. America's government, he said, is not a democracy, not an aristocracy, not a plutocracy, not even a kleptocracy. What our government has become is a veto-ocracy. As he puts it, a vetocracy. A vetocracy, meaning it is trivially easy to veto changes inside of our policy process, and therefore no reasonable changes happen. Now, he attributes this to a design of the framers, very articulated checks and balances, and to the evolution of a highly polarized political environment. Those two things together, he suggests, are a disaster for governance because those two things together mean it's trivially easy for either side to stop the other from doing anything. Now, I think that account is true, but it is incomplete. Because in addition to the checks and balances and the polarization, we have to include an account of the way money influences the policy decision. Because in this republic the framers gave us, not a pure democracy, but rather a complicated democracy, we should understand the checks and balances as the complexity, for example, of a highly tuned Swiss watch. I don't know if that's what that is, but let's pretend that's a Swiss watch for a second. And as you imagine the mechanism of that watch, crafted with care by the framers, then imagine honey poured into the middle of that mechanism. And the honey, the gold here, is the role of money inside this political system. Because in any system where such a tiny, tiny number are the relevant funders of campaigns, the critical first stage to getting elected, what that means is that a tiny fraction of that tiny number, that's really, really tiny, has the capacity to leverage their power to block any reform. And what that means is the change of any kind, whether from the left or from the right, fails inside the system. It is vetoed inside the system. So whether you care about climate change or financial reform or tax reform or the debt, it doesn't matter. This is the veto in the vetocracy, because the ability to leverage the influence of that funding is a guarantee of the ability to block this very elaborate system from being able to achieve consensus and ratify change. And what that leads to is the core recognition that until we change how campaigns are funded, sane policy is not possible in this system. We've evolved a system where the steering wheel has become disconnected from the drive shaft. And the point is, it's not just a problem because policy doesn't track the average voter, as the Princeton study suggests. Even if it doesn't track the average voter, even if it tracked, the attitudes of the educated or some other group, the more important problem is we've evolved a system because of these vetoes where sane policy of whatever form just isn't possible, can't happen anymore. This is what tweedism in America does. This is what corruption in America is. Okay. So in these lectures over the next 5 weeks, my objective is to study institutional corruption. And what I've described so far should give you a stronger sense of what that might be. I've told you what it's not. It's not about individuals, it's about institutions, at least to the extent that individuals are not responsible for creating those institutions directly. It's not about intent, but it might be about intent to keep those corrupt institutions alive. It's not about crime, unless there's a crime in not remedying the corruption that I've identified. It's not about those things, but here's what it is. Here's what you've wanted from the beginning, a definition. So here's the definition. Institutional corruption, the way I'm describing it, is an influence within an economy of influence that weakens the effectiveness of an institution, especially by weakening public trust of that institution. So in this lecture today, I've tried to suggest that tweedism is this idea of dependence corruption, and dependence corruption is a kind of institutional corruption. And against the background of this definition, I suggest we can see why tweedism and the dependence corruption it produces weakens the effectiveness of our government. That's Fukuyama's point in calling our government a vetocracy, especially by weakening the public trust of our government. And if any statistic is clear, it is the incredible collapse of the public's confidence in the institution of Congress. In the summer, 7% expressed confidence in what Congress does. And that lack of confidence is tied directly, as polls reveal, to the public's perception that Congress is not responding to the views of voters, but Congress is responding to the views of the funders. Now, Congress is just one example. In the course of these lectures, I want to talk about finance, about the media, about the academy, and after laying out these various contexts within which we might see something we would call institutional corruption, I then want to describe categories of remedies, including remedies for the institutional corruption I've described today. And I can pull this together in this way because I draw on this incredible amount of research that has been done for the last 5 years at the Safra Center at Harvard, where 5 years ago we launched a project on institutional corruption, and literally hundreds of researchers have, over the last 5 years, developed case studies and analyses of various institutions as they relate to the problem of institutional corruption. And over the course of the next 4 lectures, what I want to present to you is as much their work as my own, some of it not yet published, some of it just about to be published, but work that tries to help us understand the sense in which these essential public institutions of finance, media, and the academy are potentially describable as subject to a similar kind of institutional corruption. Now, why is it important to frame this problem in exactly this way? What is the gap between current ways of understanding these different institutions and the way that I suggest institutional corruption might complement? And I think the gap is that ethics here needs an institutional frame. We need to develop a way of talking about institutions in more explicitly ethical terms, not just about what's good or bad for the institution, but what's right or wrong for the institution relative to its own ethical frame. And we need that way of speaking because that way of speaking is critical to mobilize people to reform an institution, and it's also critical to help people resist the ways in which these institutions become compromised. It is our way of looking at the world that ethical frames are the tools we use to help order our conversations about our lives, and I think increasingly we must about the institutions as well. And the research that we will be reviewing in these lectures, especially in the emerging field of behavioral ethics, which is an extension of behavioral economics, as well as psychology, show the power, I suggest, and the need for this ethical framing. There's surprises in this research. The idea that it's actually small gifts that are more corrupting than large gifts, and the kind of troubling conclusion that professionals, especially the intelligent, are the more likely to be corrupted in this process than the less educated and more average voter. These are the conclusions that come from a wide range of research that we've been able to draw together in this framework of institutional corruption. But I think this way of understanding the ethics of an institution is especially important with respect to a democracy. Because we need a way to think about our government that is before we think about partisan perspectives on our government. We need to rediscover the idea that citizens come first before one is a Democrat or a Republican. And an ethical frame for thinking about the way a government functions is precisely the way we speak that abstracts us from the particular interest of a partisan understanding. And with each of these institutions, finance, the media, and the academy, the problems that will emerge almost all lead back to the core corruption I've talked about today, the corruption inside of Congress. Because the corruption here turns out to affect all of these other institutions too. Now, sometimes when I pull this together, as these lectures intend to, it feels a little dark. My agent, reviewing my work when I worked on copyright and the internet, said, okay, your brand is pessimism, and you have to stay focused on your brand. And I was happy to do that when you were talking about the internet or about copyright. It was a dark, horrible thing. But, the truth is, I desperately want to be optimistic about this problem. Because, truth be told, copyright is a pretty esoteric field. Not much really turns on it. Don't tell any of my friends I said that, but It doesn't really matter that much. But this problem is fundamental. This problem is critical. And for any of us with children, as we think about those children, in the world that we're leaving to them, this problem is the first problem we have to find a way to address. But the pessimism and the hopelessness around this problem is almost palpable as you talk to citizens about it. We did a poll at the end of last year. We found, when we asked, how important is it to you that the influence of money in politics be reduced? We found 96% of Americans said it was important. But then the next question was, how likely do you think it is that the influence of money in politics will be reduced? And we found 91% said it wasn't likely. So when you take these numbers together, 96 plus 91, you begin to understand the politics of resignation. At least 96% of us wish we could fly like Superman, but because we know we can't, at least 91% of us don't throw ourselves off of tall buildings regularly. We are resigned to the reality that life includes death, taxes, and a corrupt government, and we just go on with this reality, never imagining there is something to do about it. But I think that means the challenge for us is to figure out how we can resist the resigned. What is the strategy for giving people a reason not to be resigned anymore? And if you think back across the history of civil rights or political movements, you recognize the first critical step is to identify who are the people most burdened by this problem. Now, that question is pretty easy to answer for some of the important struggles in our history. For race equality, it was pretty easy to identify who were the people who were burdened. They were African Americans who were burdened. Of course, we also would say whites, especially in the South, were burdened by the perversions of society that inequality produced, but the people who felt it daily were African Americans. That question is harder to answer in the context of corruption. It's harder to find the people who are particularly burdened. But this is where I want to reflect back to the scenes that I opened this talk with. Because if you think about the extraordinary activism that happened in Hong Kong, we should recognize the first people who showed up, who sat down, who protested, were students. They were the students. And it was only when the parents began to feel guilty about the fact that they were out on the front line defending a democracy that Occupy Central turned out hundreds of thousands to join the students. Even kindergartners were sitting on the street protesting this corruption in democracy. And I think it's that same group here that needs to recognize the particular vulnerability that they face because of this corruption. Because, for example, we all recognize, I take it, that we are wrecking our climate. But for those of us over 50, it's not going to matter that much to us. I mean, we're going to talk about it. We'll hear Al Gore talking about it. It'll be in our faces for the rest of our life, no doubt. But the real burden of climate change is going to be on them. Or think about the debt. We've literally lost the political capacity to even address the problem of the growing debt. But what is the debt but an explicit borrowing from our kids, borrowing that we will never have to pay back, but they will? Or think about healthcare, a system that because of policy gifts to pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies costs way too much and delivers way too little. But for us, especially us that work in an institution like this, it's not really a problem for us, but it's especially a problem for them. Or think about an economy that seems to have stalled in its ability to reward anybody but the very rich, while denying growth and opportunity for not us, we're at the end, for them. The point is, in each of these policy contexts, we are externalizing our problem on them, on our children. Now, I don't think we're evil for doing that. I think we're just pathetic. We're not actively taking something from our kids. We're just sitting by doing nothing as this corruption corrupts their future. We're not the Nazis in this story. We're the good Germans. And somehow, we have to find a way to recognize responsibility here. We have to find a way to act on it. And the first step is understanding. Understanding that there's an evil that even good people cause. By allowing the essential institutions of a free society to become corrupted. Because that's what we have done. And that's what we must change. Thank you very much.
I think it's clear that you have failed. Failed to emulate Elizabeth Anscombe. I worry now only about the size of the room for the next lectures. I invite you all to the next only four lectures on consecutive Thursdays in the Regenstein Library. And for those of you who would like to see this lecture again, and in fact all of the lectures, you can go to the Randy and Melvin Berlin Family Lectures website, and you will see videos of all the lectures. What you will not capture on that website, so I urge you to come to each of the lectures in the flesh, is the presence and the energy of Larry Lessig in person. Once again, thank you.